Genesis Rabbah, Introduction to Midrash, Fall 2013. This presentation is based on the Strack and Stemberger Introduction to the Talmud and Midrash, pages 276 to 83. Bereshit Rabbah has been known by many names. In the Aruch, it was called the Halachot Gedolot. It has been called in Bereshit to Rabbi Oshaya after the first name tradent in Genesis Rabbah 1:1, and it has also been called Baraita de Bereshit Rabbah. The name Rabbah is somewhat of a mystery. It is unsuitable to think of it as the Great Genesis, opposing Bereshit Rabbah to the biblical text. Many scholars have had ideas about what Rabbah means. Sunz's theory, and Leopold Sunz is one of the major figures in the beginning of the scientific study of Judaism. He thought the original name was Bereshit to Rabbi Oshaya Rabbah, and that later just Rabbi Oshaya was dropped, and so therefore you have Bereshit Rabbah. However, our best textual witness never reads it as Bereshit to Rabbi Oshaya Rabbah, meaning the genesis of Rabbi Oshaya the Elder. Is always just Bereshit to Rabbi Oshaya. Rabbah might therefore be a term of distinction, distinguishing Genesis Rabbah from a smaller commentary on Genesis. So in Theodore's view, and Theodore is one of the editors of the critical edition. In fact, he was the first to work on the critical edition, and his work was completed by Hanoch Albeck. In Theodore's view, Genesis Rabbah signified Genesis Rabbah chapters 1 through 29, which have much larger, more expansive readings of the earlier parts of Genesis. And then from Genesis 30 on, you have much shorter interpretations of individual verses. So Genesis Rabbah would be the greater commentary on Genesis as distinguished from the remainder. And that this term Rabbah was then designated for the whole collection Genesis. So Genesis Rabbah became the name for Genesis Rabbah 1 through 100. And then this name, further Rabbah, was transferred to other midrashim because medieval commentators or medieval collectors would transmit this Genesis commentary with other commentaries, such as Lamentations Rabbah or Leviticus Rabbah. And these commentaries on Leviticus and Lamentations then became also known as Rabbah. So we then have Genesis Rabbah, Leviticus Rabbah, Lamentations Rabbah. And then all subsequent midrashim on the Pentateuch took on the name Rabbah, and even some of the Megillot. What is the content and structure of Genesis Rabbah? Well, first, it's an exegetical midrash on Genesis. That means each part of the verses from the book of Genesis receives some commentary in one form or another. So Genesis Rabbah offers simple explanations of words and sentences, short or elaborate Haggadic interpretations, and full expositions of texts. Things get a little varied after chapter 92. After chapter 92, the verse-by-verse commentary is abandoned, and Genesis Rabbah chapters 95 through 97 shows some significant variation in the manuscripts. The manuscript known as MS Vatican 30 has a different textual version than the printed editions, and it's this edition that must be considered original. The printed edition usually has 100 different parshiot for Genesis Rabbah. The manuscripts vary between 97 and 101. So the manuscript from Vatican 30 has 101 different parshiot. The work as a whole is particularly characterized by proems, or petich ta'ot, and all but 7 parshiot contain one or more petich ta'ot. Just to refresh your memory, a proem is a verse from a different part of the Bible that heads the exegesis that's to come. So, for example, Genesis Rabbah 1:1 begins with a verse from Proverbs 8. That is the proem, and then it works its way back to Genesis chapter 1. Well, how are the parshiot divided in Genesis Rabbah? Well, there are different scholarly views about this question. Hanoch Albeck, who follows Theodore, thinks that the divisions are based on the closed and open sections of the Bible. Alternatively, Joseph Heinemann argues that the proems are the dividing factor that creates the different parshiot, and he bases his idea on the idea that there were different orders, or sidarim, on which Genesis was preached, and so he argues for a homiletical context for the division of the parshiot. This opinion is no longer received favorably by most scholars. The third suggestion is that of the Israeli scholar Ofer Meir, who argues that the parshiot contain thematic units. So, for example, Genesis Rabbah 8 deals with the question of the text Na'aseh Adam b'Tzelmenu kidmutenu. Let us make a human being in our image according to our likeness. And those texts that deal with that theme comprise that parsha. What are the sources of Genesis Rabbah? It is clear that the redactors drew upon a wealth of rabbinic tradition. Concerning texts that we don't have in our collections anymore, there are a few different possibilities. Was Genesis Rabbah based on some kind of earlier original text called an Ur text? Or did the redactors have an earlier version which they freely added to and embellished? Or possibly did they have oral traditions which they then composed? This is an unsettled question in scholarship. But we do know that Genesis Rabbah connects to other known rabbinic material. So, for example, we have some quotations from Aquila's Greek translation of the Torah. There are also some clear parallels in the Aramaic Targums. There are not exact quotations, but there are parallel quotations to the Mishnah and other Braitot. And there are even some parallels with the Palestinian Talmud. Like everything in scholarship, we can't make an unequivocal judgment regarding the direct use of certain writings. So, did Genesis Rabbah quote earlier texts verbatim, or did Genesis Rabbah know earlier texts and then adapted them for its own purpose? One of the major questions is, what is the relationship between our Palestinian Talmud, our Yerushalmi, and Genesis Rabbah? This is an important question for the dating of Genesis Rabbah. If our Genesis Rabbah used our Palestinian Talmud, then our Genesis Rabbah necessarily would be later than our Palestinian Talmud. So the scholars Frankel and Suntz believed that Genesis Rabbah used our Palestinian Talmud, and therefore Genesis Rabbah is later than the Palestinian Talmud. Albeck, on the other hand, thought that our Genesis Rabbah used something that was equivalent to our Palestinian Talmud, but not the Palestinian Talmud itself. And this proposition was based on a comprehensive study that Albeck did, and therefore he reasons that our Genesis Rabbah and our Palestinian Talmud both go back to an earlier version of the Palestinian Talmud. So that puts the dating of Genesis Rabbah and the Palestinian Talmud more or less contemporaneous. What is the redaction and dating of Genesis Rabbah? Genesis Rabbah, based on the rabbis that are named and events mentioned in the Palestinian Talmud, suggest a date of sometime after 400. The place of redaction of Genesis Rabbah is Palestine, and that is true of all of the classical midrashim. However, the text of Genesis Rabbah as we have it has not come to us fully formed from that time, but it has become the subject to various expansions and even omissions. So, for example, we already talked about this. Chapters 96 through 100 display several variations. So, Suntz pointed out affinities between Genesis Rabbah and another genre of midrash called Tanhuma, which we'll get to later on in the semester. And Albeck even concedes that chapters 95 and 96 are homilies from Tanhuma. So after chapter 96 of Genesis Rabbah, it's hard to say what is Genesis Rabbah and what is different. However, the four last parshiot, chapters 97 through 100, are genuine parts of Genesis Rabbah. Now, how they're broken down by different number systems, depending on different manuscripts and printed editions, is sometimes hard and difficult to pin down. The exception to this rule is that there are some paragraphs in this section that are marked as Lishana Acharina in the last two parshiot, and those are not genuine parts of Genesis Rabbah. The text. Manuscript versions. Manuscript Vatican 60 is the oldest extant manuscript. Unfortunately, Tate or Albeck didn't use it for their critical edition. Manuscript Vatican 30, which is a manuscript dated to the 10th or 11th century, is an Egyptian manuscript, is considered to be the best textual version. The manuscript of the British Museum was the one chosen by Theodore as the base text for his edition. Geniza fragments. We have several Geniza fragments of Genesis Rabbah. These fragments were compiled and analyzed for a total of 12 different manuscripts by Michael Sokoloff in his Geniza Fragments of Bereshit Rabbah. Printed edition. The first printed edition is the Constantinople edition of 1512. The 1545 edition became the base for numerous further editions, including the Vilna 1887, which is sort of the traditional text. As I've been speaking all along, the critical edition is by Theodor Albeck. It is called Midrash Bereshit Rabbah, the critical edition with notes and commentaries in 3 volumes. And this is the version, in the absence of anything better, that most scholars use for critical studies of Genesis Rabbah. This concludes the PowerPoint presentation on Genesis Rabbah.